Well, we are short on time because we continue to follow some breaking news this morning. A preliminary report has just been released from Ethiopian officials following the crash of a Boeing 737 MAX jet last month after it took off from that country. The Ethiopian report says the plane repeatedly nosedived before it went down and that the flight crew performed all recommended procedures but still could not control the jet. Investigators there are blaming an anti-stall feature on the jet that has been, of course, the focus of the global investigation. Let's bring in aviation journalist Seth Kaplan. Thank you, sir, for rushing to the studio. We certainly appreciate it, Seth. First off, your take on what the Ethiopians say was not pilot error.
At least based on what they're saying. We're back, Cheryl, to kind of where we started. You might remember in the days following this crash, we said, look, Ethiopian Airlines is not Lion Air, an airline with a rather good safety reputation. You know, how could this happen again? Then there were all these questions about whether the pilots did, in fact, follow procedures, whether they had gotten that updated education based on what had happened in the Lion Air crash. This preliminary release, at least, is saying that they did everything they could, it sounds like. The other thing we're learning here is that it was, again, a sensor, another similarity with the Lion Air crash that apparently caused this. So we'll have to hear what Boeing, the FAA, and others have to say about this, but at least based on this, it sounds very much like the Lion Air crash, with the major difference being that the pilots seem to have done everything they could.
So there was maybe more pilot procedures that were done correctly in this crash. And this, again, is this initial Ethiopian report. We're going to hear more, I'm sure. But at the same time, what about pilot? You know, there's been a lot of kind of concern about these global pilots, these overseas pilots, not having any simulator training in the MAX jet, and then also not having enough training in general. I'm thinking of the first officer in the Ethiopian cockpit who had very little training at all. Did that play a factor here, do you think?
Not based on what they're saying. And that's common, by the way, around the world, not only in developing countries like Ethiopia, but the requirement in the U.S. now that you need 1,500 hours experience just to sit in that right seat, just to be the first officer, is unusual around the world. So even, let's say, in Western Europe, it would be common to have a pilot with just a few hundred hours in the right seat. So that in itself, yeah, I mean, you're right, obviously not a particularly experienced pilot, but that wouldn't necessarily cause something like this. We've all flown safely on planes where at least that pilot, the first officer, didn't have a whole lot of experience.
How do you feel about what Boeing is doing right now? They have been criticized repeatedly. Now you've got lawmakers in Washington going after them for maybe being too close to the FAA, having this FAA representative being a Boeing employee, the fact that maybe we did not actually examine this aircraft enough, that maybe it shouldn't have been in the air in the first place. A lot of criticisms on Boeing. What do you say?
Yeah, and this doesn't help that, right? The idea that maybe it was at least partly pilot error, and again, we want to emphasize this is all still preliminary, all based just on the Ethiopian investigation, but the idea that maybe the pilots didn't do what they should have done, if anything, didn't change the tragedy, but helped Boeing, kind of mitigated the impact. If this is more squarely on Boeing, that's unhelpful. It needs to continue doing what it's doing to give the world confidence that this plane is safe with the fixes.
Seth, we literally appreciate you waking up to come on the show this morning. We really appreciate getting the breaking news for us. Thank you, Seth.
You got it, Cheryl. Thank you.